Silas Boone's boot connected with the wooden bucket before Mabel even heard him coming. The sound of it clanging off the porch rail was the only warning she got, and by then, his hand was already in her hair. "Where is it?" His voice was low, which was worse than when he shouted. Low meant he had already decided. "The coffee tin, Mabel. I want what's in it." She didn't answer fast enough. He yanked her sideways off the porch step, and the ground came up hard under her knees. 2 years of hiding those coins. 2 years of skipping meals, of selling eggs she never told him about, of stitching together a future he didn't know existed. And he'd found it in under a minute. The tin was already in his other hand, the lid bent back, a few dimes scattering into the dirt like they meant nothing. "You've been stealing from me." Not a question. "It was mine," she said. "I earned it." He threw the tin at the fence post and dragged her across the yard. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to believe, truly believe, that no one is coming, that this is simply the life you were handed and the best you can do is survive it, then you already understand Mabel Ashcroft better than most people ever will. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow her story all the way to the end, because what happens next is the kind of thing that changes a person completely. And you don't want to miss a single moment of it. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most mornings started on the Boone homestead, with Mabel awake before the sun, moving quietly through the kitchen so she didn't disturb him, measuring coffee by feel because she'd learned a long time ago that the scrape of the tin lid against the counter could wake Silas in a bad mood, and a bad mood before breakfast meant a bad day for everyone, which in practical terms meant a bad day for her, since she was the only other person there. She was 20 years old. She had been married at 18, which at the time had seemed like rescue. Her father's farm failing, 4 younger siblings to feed, and Silas Boone arriving with a wagon, a proposition, and the patient expression of a man who knew he was the only offer on the table. He wasn't wrong. He was 41, owned 300 acres of Wyoming grassland, and had a reputation as a hard worker. Her father had shaken his hand like he was doing Mabel a favor. She told herself it would be fine. The thing about telling yourself something enough times is that eventually you stop hearing the words and just feel the shape of them. This hollow, worn, smooth reassurance that doesn't quite fit anymore, but that you carry anyway because without it, there's nothing. By the end of the first month, she understood that Silas Boone was not a hard worker. He was a man who had built something through methods she hadn't been told about, and who maintained it through fear, and who had learned very early in their marriage that Mabel was easy to silence. Not because she was weak. She understood that now, 2 years later, even if she couldn't have named it at the time. She was easy to silence because she was careful, because she thought before she spoke, because she watched people and tried to understand what they needed before she reacted. And Silas had taken that quality, that patience, that steadiness, and turned it into something he could use. He told her she was slow, told her she was stupid, told her that her size was proof of her failure as a woman, as a wife, as a human being worth keeping. He said it so many ways, so many times, that she had started to hear his voice in her own head even when he wasn't in the room. Nobody wants you. Nobody believes you. Nobody's coming. The coffee tin had been her secret for 14 months. It started with a quarter she found in the lining of an old coat, probably Silas's, probably forgotten. And she'd looked at it for a long time before she put it in her apron pocket. Then, a few weeks later, she sold a dozen eggs to a passing traveler while Silas was in town, and she kept the coins. Not all of them. Just a few. Just enough that he wouldn't notice. She hid them in the tin behind the loose board under the window seat, and every few weeks she'd take the tin out at night when he was asleep and count what was there. She never let herself think too specifically about what she was saving for. Thinking too specifically made it feel fragile. But the general shape of it, leaving, getting out, going somewhere that Silas Boone's voice didn't fill every room, that shape was clear enough to get her through most mornings. She had $4.63 when he found it. She was out on the porch shelling beans when she heard him come in from the barn, heard the particular pattern of his boots across the floor that meant he was looking for something. She didn't know what. She kept shelling beans, kept her hands moving. The thing to do when Silas was looking for something was to be visibly occupied and unrelated to whatever he was after. She heard the window seat creak. Her hand stopped. She heard the board, the tin. She was already standing when he came through the door, and she saw in his face that he had it. And she saw something else too, a satisfaction there, almost calm, because this was the thing about Silas that she had taken a long time to understand. He didn't lose his temper. He didn't storm and rage like some men did. He went quiet and deliberate, and that was so much worse, because it meant he'd thought about what he was going to do, and he was doing it on purpose. "You've been stealing from me," he said. "It was mine." Her voice was steadier than she expected. "I earned it from the eggs. The traveling man paid me for... Those are my chickens." He stepped off the porch. "My eggs, my money." "Silas, how long?" He was walking toward her. Not fast, the way a man walks when he already knows the other person has nowhere to go. "How long you been hiding this?" "I wasn't hiding it. I was..." "How long?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she'd learned that answering questions like this never helped. Whatever she said became the next thing he was angry about. He threw the tin at the fence post and grabbed her arm and then her hair and pulled... The word wasn't quite right, but it was the one that fit. Dragged was the right word. Dragged her off the porch step and across the yard. The beans scattered. She tried to get her feet under her and couldn't. Her knees hit the dirt, and she felt the skin tear, and she heard herself make a sound that she immediately felt ashamed of. Not because she thought she should be silent, but because the sound was so small, so defeated, and she had promised herself a long time ago that she would not sound defeated. "You think somebody's going to help you?" He was standing over her now, and his voice had gone quieter still, which was how she knew this was the part that mattered to him. The part where he said the thing out loud that he wanted her to believe. "You think anybody looks at you and thinks rescue? You think any man in this county, in this whole territory, wants anything to do with a woman your size? You're an embarrassment, Mabel. You're an embarrassment to look at. I did you a favor marrying you, and this is what you do." She was on her knees in the dirt, and the sky was very wide and very blue above her, and she stared at his boots and felt something shift inside her. Not breaking. She'd been broken before and knew that feeling. This was different. This was something going flat, going still. She thought $4.63. She thought 14 months. She thought, "I am 20 years old." She didn't hear the horse until it was close. Silas heard it first and looked up, and she felt his grip on her arm loosen by just enough that she could breathe, because he was aware of the audience, because there was one thing Silas Boone cared about more than controlling her, and that was what other people thought of him. The horse stopped a few yards away. She looked up. The man on the horse was maybe 30, maybe a few years past it, with the kind of stillness that came not from being relaxed, but from having been in enough situations that required stillness, that it had become default. He wore trail clothes, plain and worn, a hat that had seen weather. He wasn't looking at Silas. He was looking at her. Not the way men usually looked at her. That quick flick of assessment followed by the equally quick look away. The way people look at something they've decided in advance they don't want to engage with. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. Straight, steady, without apology for the looking and without the cruelty that usually accompanied that kind of attention when it came from strangers. "You need to let go of her," the man said. His voice was quiet, conversational, almost, like he was noting the time. Silas shifted his weight. She felt it in the grip on her arm. "This is my wife. This is a private matter on private land." "I see that." The man didn't move. "Let go of her." "You got business here?" "Not until about 2 minutes ago." There was a moment. She would think about this moment for a long time afterward, where Silas assessed whether this was worth it. She could feel him doing the calculation. He was not a man who shied from confrontation, but he was a man who chose his confrontations carefully, and she could feel him trying to determine what kind of man this was on the horse, what category to place him in, whether this was a fight he could win cleanly or one that might cost him something. He must have decided it was the first kind. He let go of her arm and straightened up and walked toward the horse. "Get off my land," he said, and there was real authority in his voice, the authority of a man who had said those words before and had them obeyed. The man on the horse looked at him for a moment. Then he swung down from the saddle in a single, unhurried motion, and he was taller than she'd realized, and he walked to where she was kneeling in the dirt and crouched down beside her without taking his eyes off Silas. "Can you stand?" he asked. Quiet. Just for her. "Yes," she said, which was true in the technical sense, though her knees were shaking. He didn't help her up. He didn't touch her. He just stayed where he was, crouched between her and Silas, and waited while she got her feet under her and stood. Silas moved. She wasn't watching him closely enough to see the beginning of it. She was concentrating on standing, on not swaying, on keeping her face composed. But she saw the end of it, which was Silas's fist swinging and the stranger not stepping back, but stepping in, which was the thing that surprised her. Most people stepped back from a punch. This man stepped in, inside the swing, and did something fast and economical that she couldn't quite follow, and Silas was on the ground. It happened that quickly. No flourish, no declaration. Silas swung, and then Silas was on the ground, blinking at the sky with the expression of a man who had just encountered something that did not fit his understanding of how the world operated. The stranger stood over him. "Stay down," he said. Still that same quiet voice. Silas said something. She didn't catch the specific word, but caught the shape of it, caught that it was an obscenity and a threat. And the stranger's expression didn't change. He turned away from Silas like a man turning away from something that had stopped being relevant and looked at her. "My name is Rowan Mercer," he said. "Do you have somewhere to go right now? Somewhere off this property?" She stared at him. "No," she said. "No, I don't." He nodded once, like that was simply information, like it didn't change anything essential. "Then we'll figure that out." Silas was getting up behind him, and Rowan didn't look, just kept watching her, waiting for her to say something, and she understood suddenly that he was giving her the choice. That despite the fact that he had just put her husband on the ground, he was not going to make any further decision about her situation without her input. "He's getting up," she said. "I know." Rowan glanced back once, assessed, glanced back at her. "He'll think about it differently if he comes at me again. Whether he does that is up to him." Silas did not come at him again. What Silas did was stand up, brush off his clothes with a deliberate slowness that was meant to communicate something about his dignity, and look at both of them with an expression that Mabel recognized. It was his planning face, the face he wore when he was deciding how to respond to something that had disrupted his sense of order. She'd seen it when a fence went down in a storm. She'd seen it when a deal fell through in town. She'd seen it when she'd first told him she wanted to learn to read accounts. "You've made a serious mistake," he said to Rowan. Not shouting, just stating. "Probably made a few in my life," Rowan said. "Don't think today's one of them." Silas looked at Mabel then, and the look was specific and familiar. It was the look that said, "This isn't over," that said, "I know where you sleep," that said all the things he'd been saying to her for 2 years, in a language built entirely of expression and implication, because a man like Silas Boone understood perfectly well that the most effective threats are the ones you never have to say out loud. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away, and she felt a sharp twist of something that was not quite shame but was related to it. The particular way a person feels when they've been afraid for so long that the fear has become structural, has become part of the way they hold themselves, part of the reason they look away. "Let's walk," Rowan said beside her. Not a command, more like a suggestion from someone who was very certain it was a good idea. She walked. They went out through the front gate and down the road 100 yards before he slowed and turned and said, "You're hurt." She looked down. Her palms were scraped raw and one knee was bleeding through her skirt. "I'm fine." He looked at her with the expression of someone who understood that "I'm fine" was not a description of her condition but a statement of intent. "There's a creek about a 1/4 mile down. We can clean those up." "I don't need—" "Not asking you to need anything," he said. "Just saying the creek is there." She went to the creek. While she was washing her hands in the cold water, crouched at the bank with her skirt hiked up to keep it dry, she heard him settle back against a cottonwood a respectful distance away and begin doing something. She couldn't see what. She was watching the blood thin out in the current, and the silence was different from the silences she was used to. The silences in Silas's house were not empty. They were loaded, compressed, full of the potential of whatever Silas was deciding in the absence of words. This silence just existed. It wasn't preparation for something. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was cleaning a piece of tack, a saddle strap or something similar, with a small cloth, the way a person does when they need something to do with their hands in a situation where standing doing nothing would feel intrusive. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "Saw a man dragging a woman across a yard." "There's plenty of that in Wyoming." "Sure," he said. I still stopped. She turned back to the creek, watched the water for a minute. "You're passing through?" "I was." A pause. "Might be I'm not now." She didn't know what to do with that, so she didn't say anything. He seemed comfortable with her not saying anything. "I don't know what you've been told about yourself," he said after a while, "but I'd be willing to bet most of it is wrong." She laughed, a short, involuntary sound. "You've known me for 10 minutes. Known you for 10 minutes and watched you stand up after what just happened with more composure than most men I've ridden with would have managed. That's not nothing." She looked at him then, turning all the way around to look at him properly, trying to determine what this was. because she understood by now that kindness from men came in several varieties, and not all of them were actually kindness. There was the kindness that was really pity, the kind that made you feel worse about yourself while the person offering it felt better about themselves. There was the kindness that was currency, that was given to buy something the giver hadn't named yet. There was the kindness that was condescension in thinner clothes. He looked back at her with the same directness he'd had from the moment he stopped his horse. No calculation in it that she could see. No performance. "What do you want?" she asked. Flat. Not hostile, but not soft either. Right now, don't have any immediate agenda. He folded the cloth and tucked it away. "Might be worth knowing where you're planning to sleep tonight, though, since I'd guess inside that house isn't ideal." She hadn't thought that far. She realized she hadn't thought past the creak, that she had been operating moment to moment since she heard the window seat creak, and her mind was just now beginning to extend itself forward in time to consider what came next. What came next was complicated. Silas owned the house. Silas knew everyone in the county, the sheriff included, who had come to dinner twice and who had a particular way of not quite looking at Mabel's face that she had decided meant he'd guessed some of what went on and had chosen not to know officially. The closest town with anything like a women's refuge or a sympathetic boarding house was 40 miles east, and she had no horse, no money. The $4.63 were still in Silas's hand, and no one who would be surprised to see Silas Boone arrive in town looking for his wife and leave with her. She knew all of this in about 4 seconds, because this was not a new thought. She had run these calculations before. She had run them many times, lying in the dark, listening to Silas breathe, trying to find the angle she'd missed. The calculation always came out the same. Except, now there was a variable she hadn't had before, sitting against a cottonwood tree 20 feet away, waiting without pressure for her to decide what she wanted to do next. "I know a way out," she heard herself say. Rowan looked up from his saddle. "Not the road," she said. "Silas will have men on the road inside an hour. He's got 3 ranch hands he'll call in, and the sheriff owes him a favor. But there's a trail that runs north along Bitter Creek. You wouldn't know it unless you traveled it, and most people haven't, because the last 6 miles are rough and they angle back south before they hit the ridge. Most people think it dead ends. But it doesn't. No. It comes out near the Harmon homestead, which has been abandoned for 4 years. From there you can reach the Canyon Road, which comes out 12 miles from Casper." He was quiet for a moment. "You know this trail?" "I've ridden it 6 times. Used to take supplies out to the Harmon family before they left. Silas sent me alone because he didn't want to bother." She could see him reassessing. Not of her, but of the situation, the geography of it, the possibility. "How rough is rough?" he asked. "Your horse is in better shape than the mule I took. We'll manage." She'd said. She noticed it at the same time he did. He nodded. "Then we should move before he gets those men together." She stood up. Her knees were wet from crouching and her palms still stung, and she had $4.63 less than she'd started the morning with, and she was standing on a creek bank in Wyoming with a stranger who'd given her his name and nothing else. She thought about the tin, the worn edge of it from how many times she'd opened it, the careful way she'd put the lid back each time, pressing it down slow so it didn't make a sound. She thought about 14 months. "There's something else," she said. "All right. Before we go, there's something in the house I need." She hesitated, then decided he'd earned a straight answer. "Silas has a strongbox he thinks I don't know about, under the floorboards in the bedroom. I've seen the papers in it, not all of them, but enough. Land deeds that don't match what I know about how he bought those parcels. Financial records he keeps separate from the main accounts." She paused. "I've been managing the household accounts for 2 years. Silas let me because he didn't think I'd understand what I was looking at. He was wrong." Rowan looked at her for a moment without speaking. "I understand what forged signatures look like," she said. "I understand what it means when purchase dates don't match recorded deed dates. I've seen those papers 3 times and I remember every number on them." "How many people does he own land from?" "At least 6 families, probably more. I only saw part of what's in the box." Another silence. This one felt different, weighted with the scope of what she was describing. "He's going to destroy those papers," she said. "The moment he understands what just happened, the first thing he'll do is check that box. And if he thinks there's any chance they could be used against him, he'll burn them." "How certain are you about that?" "I've lived with the man for 2 years. She met his eyes. "I'm certain." Rowan pushed off from the cottonwood and stood up straight. He didn't look happy about what he was considering. She could see that. He looked like a man doing accurate math on a situation and not loving the answer. "The ranch hands," he said. "Are they at the property now?" "Two of them. Hector and a man named Cray. They'll be in the south barn this time of day." She paused. "Silas will be inside. He'll be drinking and thinking, which means for the next hour he'll be doing both badly." 1 hour. Maybe less. He was quiet for 10 seconds, which she was coming to understand was how he handled important decisions. Not impulsive, not sluggish, just careful. He looked north along the creek, then back toward the homestead, then at her. "You understand this is dangerous," he said. "I understand that," she said. "I also understand that without those papers, whatever we do next is just two people running. With them, it's different." "Different how?" She looked at him steadily. "It means Silas spends the rest of his life looking over his shoulder instead of me." He looked at her for another moment, then he picked up his reins. "Tell me the layout of the house," he said. She told him. She told him about the back door that stuck in its frame and had to be lifted slightly to open. About the window off the kitchen that Silas always left unlatched because he was afraid of fire and needed to believe there was an exit he could reach without going through the front room. About the loose board 3 steps before the bedroom doorway that made a sound she'd learned to avoid by stepping wide left. She told him about the strongbox, iron small enough to carry, hinge with a lock that Silas kept the key to on a chain around his neck, but that she had identified, through observation, as a standard model that could be opened with a flat piece of metal applied correctly. "How do you know that?" he asked. "Because I looked it up," she said. "In the encyclopedia Silas bought to keep on a shelf and never read. He thought books were for appearance. I thought they were for information." Something moved in his expression. Not amusement exactly. More like recognition. "There's a flat-headed tool in the barn," she continued. "Left side, second bench. Silas uses it for the harnesses. It'll work." They went back. She had expected maybe, that going back would feel like losing something, like reversing a decision she'd barely had time to make. But as they moved through the field grass parallel to the property fence, staying low, the late afternoon light making everything look quieter than it was, she found that she felt something else. Not bravery exactly. She was frightened. She could feel her own heartbeat in her temples and her hands were not entirely steady. But beneath the fear was something she didn't have a clean word for, something like purpose. She'd been afraid in that house for 2 years. She'd been afraid every morning she woke up and every night before she slept and most of the hours in between. This fear here, in this field, moving with intention toward a specific goal, this was at least a fear she was choosing. They reached the fence line. She could see the barn, the square of the house beyond it. The south barn doors were closed. "Hector's horse is still in the paddock," she said quietly. "Both of theirs. They haven't left." "What about Silas's horse?" She looked. "In the paddock too. He hasn't ridden for help yet." She calculated. "We have maybe 20 minutes. Maybe." "Then let's not use 30. They went in through the gap in the fence at the north corner, the one Silas had been meaning to fix since February. Rowan tied his horse to the post there, loose enough to free quickly, and they moved in a crouch along the back of the property toward the barn. The barn tool was where she said it would be. The window off the kitchen was where she said it would be, and it was unlatched. The loose board was where she said it would be, and they both stepped wide left of it. Silas was in the front room. She could hear him, the particular rhythm of his breathing that she had catalogued without meaning to, the way you catalog everything about a person you are afraid of. He was drinking. His boots were on the table. He wasn't moving toward the bedroom, not yet. The strongbox was beneath the third board from the left under the window. She knew because she had watched him replace that board 17 times across 2 years, always thinking she wasn't paying attention. She'd counted boards the first time she saw him do it. She had never stopped counting. Rowan pried the board up while she watched the doorway. The box came up. He worked the tool against the lock the way she described it, and she watched the doorway and listened to Silas shift in his chair. The lock gave. She exhaled. Inside the box, a bundle of papers tied with cord, a leather pouch, and a small ledger with no name on the cover. She took the papers and the ledger. Rowan took the pouch. She didn't ask what was in it yet. There wasn't time. They replaced the board. They went back out through the kitchen window. They were through the fence, and Rowan had the horse untied before she heard the floorboard. Not the one she'd warned him about, a different one, at the edge of the bedroom, the one she sometimes forgot about herself. Creak under Silas's weight. He'd gone to check. "Now," she said, and she didn't look back. They moved through the field and into the tree line, and she counted steps and listened for shouting behind them, and when the shouting came, Silas's voice, cracked and raw and no longer quiet. They were already in the trees and moving north toward Bitter Creek, toward the trail that dead-ended but didn't, toward the ridge and the canyon road and the 12 miles that lay between them and Casper and whatever came next. She was 20 years old, and she was running, and her knees were still bleeding through her skirt, and she was carrying papers that could destroy a man's empire. And for the first time in 2 years, she was running toward something instead of just away. Behind them, Silas Boone's voice split the Wyoming dusk. Somewhere in it were her name and threats and the particular pitch of a man who had lost something he was certain he owned. She ran. They had been riding for 20 minutes before either of them said anything that wasn't directional. She called out the turns, and he made them without argument, which was one of the stranger experiences of her recent life, being listened to without the listener waiting for her to be wrong. Every time she said left here or stay low across the open ground or there's a crossing 50 yards ahead, look for the flat stones. He adjusted without question, without the small corrective hesitation she'd learned to expect from men who needed to believe they already knew the landscape better than whoever was guiding them. Bitter Creek ran fast this time of year. The trail above it was narrow, and in 2 places the ground had slid during spring rains, and what was left of the path was no wider than the horse's shoulders. Rowan's animal picked its way through both sections without being pushed, which told her something about how the horse had been kept and how it had been ridden. A well-treated horse moved differently than one that had been forced through hard ground against its nature. She noticed these things. She'd had a lot of time to learn what to pay attention to when direct observation of people came with consequences. The trail splits in about a mile, she said. Left fork looks better. Don't take it. Right fork? Looks like nothing, but it opens up after the rocks. He didn't ask how she knew. She appreciated that. Behind them, at some indeterminate distance muffled by the creek noise and the tree cover, she'd heard shouting about 10 minutes back. Indistinct. Possibly Silas, possibly one of the ranch hands working the perimeter. They hadn't stopped to determine which. She'd filed the sound away and kept moving, which was a skill she had developed without realizing it was a skill. The way you develop most of the things that keep you alive in a difficult situation. At the fork, Rowan took the right path without her having to say anything. She noticed that too. The papers were tucked inside her dress, against her ribs, which was uncomfortable and warm but kept them flat and concealed. The leather pouch from the strongbox was tied to Rowan's saddle. She still hadn't asked what was in it, but she'd caught him checking the knot twice, which meant it mattered. The pouch, she said. Money, he said. Coin, mostly. Some paper. More than I expected. She thought about that. How much? A pause while he estimated. $80, maybe $90. She worked through the implications of that quickly. Silas kept his operating money in the house in a locked drawer she knew the combination to but had never touched. He'd complained twice this past spring about costs and made pointed remarks about waste that were really pointed remarks about her appetite, her size, the amount of fabric her dresses required, so she'd understood money was tighter than the property suggested. $80 or $90 in a locked box meant it wasn't operating money. It was separate. Hidden separately, specifically. That's not ranch money, she said. He keeps ranch accounts in a different place. I manage them. She paused. That's payment. Something he received and didn't want attached to anything he reported. Rowan said nothing for a moment, working through the same calculation she had just made. For the land. Or for the arrangement around it. There's a difference between stealing land and getting paid to facilitate someone else stealing it. If he was a middleman, then there are other names in those papers. Probably. She shifted the documents against her ribs, feeling the edge of the cord through the fabric. I saw 2 signatures I didn't recognize on one of the deeds. Not sellers, witnesses. But they were on 3 separate documents. Same witnesses. Yes. He was quiet for a while after that. The trail rose slightly and the creek noise dropped away below them, and in the relative quiet she could hear the horse breathing and the dry sound of grassland insects, and somewhere distant, a hawk calling. The ordinary sounds of a Wyoming late afternoon that had nothing to do with what was happening to her, that would continue sounding exactly the same regardless of whether she made it to Casper or didn't. The world didn't adjust its atmosphere to match the crises of the people moving through it, which was either comforting or the opposite, depending on the day. Today, it was a little of both. Hector, she said. It had been sitting in the back of her mind since the property. The ranch hand. He's been with Silas 6 years. He was there for some of it. Not all. I don't think he knows what's in the box. But he knows there are properties Silas acquired that the former owners talk about differently than Silas does. You think he'll say something? I think he's a man who wants to keep his job and doesn't want trouble, she said. Whether he tells the truth if someone official asks him directly is a different question. People answer differently when it's official. Some do. Some just get better at the shape of the lie. She looked at the trail ahead. I wouldn't count on Hector. I wouldn't count on anyone who's been working for Silas voluntarily for 6 years. The right fork opened up the way she said it would, the narrow path widening between two rock faces into a broader slope of scrub and dry grass that ran flat for half a mile before the ground began dropping toward the valley where the Harmon homestead sat. The light was going, not gone yet, but shifting into the warm, horizontal gold of late afternoon that gave everything long shadows and made distances harder to read. She could see the Harmon house from the top of the slope. Abandoned buildings had a particular posture, a way of settling into themselves, the angles going slightly off as the foundation moved and the joints dried and the things that had held them together lost their purpose and began releasing their grip. The Harmon house had that posture now. The porch listed. One shutter hung by a single hinge, but the walls were standing and the roof looked mostly whole, and there was a well she knew still had water because she'd used it on her last supply run 4 years ago, when Clara Harmon was still alive and Mabel was 17 and had not yet met Silas Boone. She had liked Clara Harmon. Clara had been 70 years old and fierce and had opinions about everything and had looked at Mabel, really looked at her, the way the man riding beside her now looked at her, and said, "You're going to figure out what you're worth eventually. I hope it doesn't take you too long." It had taken her too long. "We'll stop here," Rowan said, already reading the same calculations she was making about the light and the horse's condition and the remaining miles. "Canyon Road is 12 miles from the east edge of the Harmon land," she said. "We can reach it by mid-morning if we rest until first light." "That works?" He unsaddled the horse and walked him to the well and worked the handle while the animal drank, and she stood in the yard of the abandoned house and looked at the sky and thought about Silas back on the property, discovering the box was open and the papers were gone. She could picture it precisely. The specific quality of stillness that would come over him, followed by the first decision about who to call and in what order, followed by the controlled, methodical fury of a man who did not panic but who also did not forgive. She was under no illusion that he would not come after her. The question was not whether but how fast and through which channels, and the honest answer was that she didn't know how fast, because she had never pushed him to the point where he'd had to deploy everything he had. She knew the surface of his influence, the sheriff, a few businessmen in town, a judge who owed him a land favor. She didn't know the depth. 2 years of observation, and she still didn't know the depth because Silas had never felt the need to show her that much. That was either a mistake on his part or a sign of how little he thought she was capable of, and at this point both amounted to the same thing. "You should eat something," Rowan said from the well. "I'm fine." "You said that at the creek too." He pulled a bundle from the saddlebag, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be bread and dried meat. He set it on the well, coping without ceremony. "I'm not going to watch you insist you're not hungry and then listen to your stomach argue with me for 3 hours." She almost smiled. She went to the well and took the bread. Inside the house, they found 2 surviving chairs and a table that held the weight of the papers when she spread them out in the last of the fading light from the doorway. Rowan lit a stub of candle from his pack and held it while she sorted. She worked methodically, the way she always worked when numbers were involved, not from one end to the other, but by type first, grouping like documents because the relationships between documents were as important as the documents themselves. That was something she'd learned from the household accounts. A single number didn't tell you much. A number in relationship to 3 other numbers across different time periods told you everything. "These are deeds," she said, separating a stack. 6 of them. 4 have purchase dates. 2 don't, which is wrong. Deeds have to show the purchase date to be recorded. These 2 are drafts or they're replacements, copies made after the fact. Why would he need copies made after the fact? Because the original showed a different date. She ran her finger along the margin of one. "Look at this. The ink here, the main text, and this date stamp, they don't match. The main text is older. The date was added later with different ink." She looked up. "If the original deed date was before the family signed any agreement, it means the property transfer was recorded before the owners agreed to it, which means they didn't agree to it." Rowan looked at the paper. He put his name on land before the owner sold it, and then probably presented them with debt, something they owed him, something that gave him the right to claim the property against the debt. It's a specific method. She hesitated. "I've read about it in one of his newspapers. There was an article about land fraud in Colorado. The method described was very close to this." "He read that article?" "I don't think so." He kept newspapers for appearance too. She looked back at the papers. He's not the origin of this method. He learned it from someone or he was taught it. Those 2 witnesses I mentioned, the ones on multiple documents. She found the relevant deeds and laid them side by side. Rowan brought the candle closer. The same 2 signatures appeared as witnesses on 3 separate documents transferring 3 different properties. She pointed to them. J. Calloway and R. Farrell. Not Silas's signatures. Witness signatures. The people who attested that the agreement was legitimate. If the same 2 people witnessed 3 separate transactions for 3 separate families selling to the same buyer, they weren't coincidental witnesses, she said. They were participants. They were part of the operation. Rowan studied the signatures. You know either of those names? Calloway. Possibly. There's a Calloway who works out of the land registry in Casper. I saw the name on a piece of official correspondence that came to the house once. Silas put it away quickly. She paused. I read it first. He looked at her. I read everything, she said. It wasn't a boast, just a fact. I always read everything. Silas thought I was slow, so he stopped being careful about what I saw. The candle wavered in a draft from the missing window pane. Outside, full dark had arrived, and the coyotes had started somewhere to the north, their voices overlapping and separating the way they did when they were tracking something. There's something you should know about me, Rowan said. He'd been quiet for long enough that when he spoke, it shifted the air in the room. She waited. I'm not just passing through. Was passing through this particular stretch of road, but I've been working in this territory for about 8 months. He leaned back from the candle. Hired work, private contract, a land attorney in Cheyenne who represents several families trying to recover property they believe was taken from them through fraud. She stared at him. His name is Aldous Porter, Rowan said. He sent me to document what I could. I've been moving between counties, talking to people, finding out what evidence exists and where. A pause. I was riding toward your property because a man named Daniel Wick, he used to own the grazing parcel east of your fence line, told me that if anyone knew the truth about how Silas Boone acquired his land, it was the woman Silas kept out at the homestead. She was quiet for a moment. The coyotes moved east and the sound diminished. Daniel Wick, she said. She remembered the name. Remembered Silas coming home one evening 2 winters ago with a particular satisfaction about him, the satisfaction of a transaction completed. She'd asked what was celebratory about his mood, and he'd said, settled a debt in the tone that meant she shouldn't follow up on it. She hadn't, but she'd noted the name on the correspondence that arrived 3 weeks later and hadn't quite matched the story Silas told her. He said Wick sold willingly. Wick says he owed Silas $400 for a loan made the year before, and that Silas called the loan early on 30 days' notice and told him the parcel was the settlement. $400 doesn't cover 40 acres of grazing land. No, Rowan said, it doesn't. She looked at the papers spread across the table. Looked at the small pool of candlelight reaching as far as it could into the corners of an abandoned house and thought about Daniel Wick and the Harmon family and Clara, who had told her she'd figure out her worth eventually, and at least 3 other families represented by these deeds who had lost land they'd built and worked and intended to pass to their children. Why didn't you introduce yourself, she said, when you stopped, if you knew who I was, or suspected? I didn't know you. I knew the name Silas Boone, and I knew the general situation. When I came around that road bend, I didn't see a woman who was part of my investigation. I just saw what was happening. He stopped. The investigation was a separate thing. She looked at him carefully. And now? Now it's not separate. He met her eyes. Now it's considerably more connected, given that you're sitting across from me with evidence that my employer has been trying to locate for 6 months. She looked back at the papers, sorted 3 more documents into the deed stack, found the ledger, and opened it. The ledger was in Silas's handwriting, cramped and slanted, always pressing too hard into the page, with dates running down the left column and numbers in the center, and in a third column, initials. Not names, just initials. S.B., she said, tracing the page. That's him. J.C., that's your Calloway probably. R.F., Farrell. She turned several pages. These numbers are payments, distributions. Someone above Silas was receiving a share. How large a share? She did the rough arithmetic in her head. About 40% of whatever the properties transferred for. Silas kept 60. She looked up. Which means either Silas was the junior partner in this, and someone else was running the larger operation, or he was paying someone for protection. For the official access, the land registry. Calloway in the registry. And whoever Calloway was paying to stay quiet about it. She closed the ledger. This is larger than Silas. Rowan said nothing for a long moment. The candle burned. Somewhere in the structure of the old house, something shifted and settled. Wood contracting in the cooler night air, the building adjusting to the dark the way buildings did when they'd been doing it for years without anyone inside to notice. "Are you scared?" he asked. It surprised her. Not the question itself, but the directness of it, the absence of any cushioning around it. She considered lying or deflecting or giving the abbreviated version of fine she'd been giving people for 2 years. She didn't. "Yes," she said. "I've been scared since I heard that board creak this afternoon. I'll probably be scared until this is finished, and maybe sometime after that." She looked at him. "But scared isn't the same as stopped. I figured that out somewhere on that trail." He nodded once. Not in the way people nodded when they were managing you, softening something difficult. In the way people nodded when they believed what you said. She went back to the ledger. She worked through it page by page while Rowan checked the perimeter, went out, walked the boundary of the Harmon yard, came back, said nothing alarming, settled back in the other chair. She worked through the ledger and the deeds and the 2 unsigned documents and built in her head a structure of it, the way she always built things in her head, the same way she'd built the picture of Silas's finances from fragments over 2 years, holding separate pieces of information until she had enough of them to see how they fit. By the time the candle had burned to a stub and she was working mostly by the moonlight coming through the doorway, she had it. 6 families, she said, 3 in this county, 2 in the county north, 1 further, but it's listed here, which means Silas had either a role or a share in that one too. She set the ledger down. The operation's been running at least 5 years, possibly 7. The earliest date I can read clearly is 1879, but there's a reference to a prior transaction from what looks like 77. "Before you were married?" "Yes." She looked at the ledger. "I came into a house that was already built on this." She hadn't expected that to land the way it did. That particular weight, the understanding that everything she'd been managing, every account she'd balanced, and every supply order she'd filed had been built on the foundation of this. She'd been keeping the books for a criminal enterprise without knowing it, and the specific irony was that the same skills she'd been forced to develop in service of Silas's operation were now the skills that could dismantle it. "You all right?" Rowan said. "I'm thinking," she said. "All right." She picked the ledger back up, turned to the final pages where the most recent entries ran. The last dated entry was 6 weeks ago. The distribution column showed a significant increase, almost double the prior quarter. Either the operation had expanded, or someone had accelerated it, or there was a deadline she didn't know about. "Something's changed recently," she said. "In the past 2 months, the amounts increased significantly." Rowan straightened in his chair. "How significantly?" "Prior quarter, the distributions averaged $40 per transaction. These last 2 months, closer to 90 to 110. She turned the ledger toward him. "Either more properties or higher value properties or both." He studied the numbers. "Or they're wrapping up." She looked at him. "If you're running a fraud operation long term, there's a point where you stop expanding and start extracting," he said. "Take as much as possible before someone notices and then move on. Change location. Repeat." He leaned back. The increased activity could mean they're planning to be done, which means they'd want to clean up loose ends. "Yes." She thought about the strongbox, about Silas discovering the papers were gone, about the specific calculation he would now be running and the particular category she had just moved into in that calculation. "He's going to tell people I stole from him," she said. "He's going to go to the sheriff and say I took money from the house and these papers are ranch documents and I took them without right." "He will," Rowan said. "That's probably already in motion. And the sheriff will come looking." "Yes. So we need to reach Casper before the sheriff has a clear direction to look," she said. "And we need Porter, the attorney, to have these papers and be ready to act before Silas can arrange a story that buries them." "That's exactly right." A pause. "Porter's been waiting 8 months for exactly this. He'll be ready." She folded the papers with care, rearranged them back into the order she'd found them. They'd need the cord, which she retied from the original knot's impression, and tucked the ledger flat beneath the stack. "First light," she said. "First light." She settled back in the chair because there was nowhere else to sleep that she felt comfortable claiming, and the chair was solid enough. She listened to the night sounds of the Harmon property and thought about Clara. Harmon telling her she'd figure out her worth eventually, and thought about the fact that she was sitting in this woman's abandoned house holding documents that could restore land to 6 families. and that the specific skills Silas had dismissed as insufficient had led directly to this moment. She thought about her knees, which had stiffened in the chair and ached. She thought about the $4.63 she no longer had, and the $90 in Rowan's saddlebag that were evidence, not available. She thought about Casper and what it would mean to walk into a lawyer's office with these papers and speak to someone who was professionally obligated to listen to her. She had never had that before. Someone professionally obligated to listen. "You said Daniel Wick told you to find me," she said into the dark. "He said the woman at the Boone homestead." "He doesn't know me. He doesn't know my name." "No," Rowan said. "He said Boone's wife, but he said it like he meant something specific, like he'd heard something about you that made you worth mentioning." She thought about that. She had met Daniel Wick once, at a county gathering 2 years ago, just after the marriage. I had been there with his wife and 3 of his children, and she had helped his youngest with a shoe buckle that had come loose, and the boy's mother had thanked her with genuine warmth, and she had thought for a moment, one of those brief, precise moments she had gotten very good at filing away. This is what normal feels like. She hadn't spoken to Daniel Wick directly. She hadn't thought he'd noticed her at all. "His youngest," she said, mostly to herself. "The boy with the shoe." Rowan was quiet. She closed her eyes. The chair was hard, and the night was cold in the way Wyoming nights were cold even in summer. That particular dry chill that came down off the higher elevations after dark. And her knees ached and her hands ached, and she was exhausted in a way that went deeper than one hard afternoon. But she did not feel alone, which was a condition so unfamiliar it was almost uncomfortable. She kept almost reaching for something to guard against it, some interior adjustment that would put the right amount of distance back between herself and another person. The guard had been load-bearing for 2 years. It was strange to sit in a room and not need it. She fell asleep sometime after that, and if she dreamed she didn't remember it, and when she woke the sky at the doorway was the specific gray-blue of very early morning, and Rowan was already at the well, already tending the horse, already making the necessary preparations for the next 12 miles in the efficient, unhurried way she was beginning to recognize as simply how he moved through the world. She stood and worked the stiffness out of her knees and picked up the papers and the ledger from the table. Outside, the Harmon yard was silver and still. The grass had that early morning look, wet without rain, catching the pre-dawn light in a way that made everything seem briefly new. She tucked the documents back against her ribs. "Canyon Road," she said. "Canyon Road," Rowan confirmed. They went. The Canyon Road was exactly what it sounded like. A dirt track cut into the side of a long rock formation that ran roughly east for about 4 miles before it flattened out into open grassland. The rock face on the left rose 30 feet. The drop on the right wasn't sheer, but it was steep enough that a horse that misjudged the edge would not recover. In the early morning light, the whole thing looked like something drawn in charcoal, all gray and shadow, and the sound of the horse's hooves on the hardpan echoed off the rock face and came back slightly wrong, slightly delayed, the way echoes always did in enclosed spaces. Mabel had ridden this road twice before, and both times alone, and the both times she'd been on a mule that had opinions about every section of it. Rowan's horse had no such opinions or kept them private and moved through the canyon at a steady pace that ate the miles without drama. She was tired in a way that had moved past the physical and into something deeper, the kind of tired that came from sustained alertness, from sleeping in a chair with one ear trained toward the dark outside, from carrying the particular weight of knowing that the man she'd spent 2 years trying not to provoke was now behind her with resources she couldn't fully map. Every shadow in the canyon that wasn't immediately explained by the rock formation got a second look. She gave it a second look and then she kept moving because stopping to examine every shadow was its own kind of trap. They cleared the canyon by mid-morning. The land that opened up on the other side was flatter, drier, the grass shorter and browner than the grassland near Bitter Creek. Casper was visible from the first high point. Not the town itself, but the suggestion of it, a thickening of the horizon, smoke from chimneys, and the particular density that collected over a place where multiple people were doing multiple things at the same time. She pointed. "I see it," Rowan said. 4 hours, maybe less. "We'll push a little, not hard, but steady." She adjusted the documents against her ribs and said nothing. They rode. The thing she kept returning to, kept working at the way you work at a loose tooth, not because it was productive, but because she couldn't leave it alone, was the question of who else knew. Not Silas, not Calloway or Farrell. She knew roughly what they knew. She meant who else in Casper, in the official structure of the territory, was aware of what Silas had been doing and had decided that awareness was a private matter. The sheriff was one. She suspected a judge. She didn't know the shape of it past that, and not knowing the shape of it meant not knowing which doors in Casper were safe to open. "Porter," she said, "tell me about him." Rowan thought for a moment, the kind of moment that told her he was choosing what was accurate rather than what was reassuring. 60 years old. Practiced law in this territory for 25 of them. He has enemies, some of them legitimate, some of them people he's beaten in court. He's not going to be surprised by what you bring him. A pause. He's also not going to be soft about it. He'll push hard on everything you tell him. He needs to, because whatever goes into a filing has to hold up. "That's fine," she said. "I'd rather be pushed hard than handled." "I thought you would be. Does he know you're coming? That you were heading toward the Boone property?" "He knows I was following a lead in that direction. He doesn't know how it came out." She thought about that. "So he doesn't know about me specifically?" "No?" "He's going to want to know how I come to have these documents, whether I had the right to take them." "He's going to ask exactly that, yes." She worked through the legal architecture of it, what she understood from 2 years of reading everything that came into the house, including a digest of territorial law that Silas had received as part of a business correspondence and left on the table, which she'd read twice and returned to the exact position she'd found it. "I'm his wife. The household is jointly maintained. I manage the accounts. That was my role. That was his arrangement, not something I claimed for myself. Documents related to the financial operation of the household could reasonably be within my purview to access." "That's an argument," Rowan said carefully. "Whether it's the argument Porter uses is his call." "I know. I'm not trying to write his filing. I'm trying to understand what I'm walking into." A beat of silence. "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Prepare. You think through things ahead of time and you do it fast, but you're always doing it." He wasn't critical, just observational. "You were doing it in that field outside the fence. I could see it." She thought about denying it, then didn't see the point. "It kept me alive," she said, "staying ahead of what was coming. It's not a skill I developed on purpose." He nodded. She saw him understand the thing under the surface of what she'd said. Not just that she was a planner, but that the planning had been survival, had been the margin between managing Silas and not managing him. They rode through the middle of the day with the sun directly overhead and no shade to speak of. She drank water from his canteen when he offered it and didn't feel strange about it, which itself was strange. The degree to which normal human transactions had felt loaded and complicated for so long that accepting a canteen felt like a negotiation she needed to decode. It was just water. He was just handing it to her. She was just thirsty. Simple things. She'd forgotten how simple things felt when they weren't layered over with the effort of managing what someone else might mean by them. 2 hours out of Casper, they hit the first problem. She saw the rider before Rowan did, coming up from the south on a course that would intersect theirs if both parties kept their current directions. She watched the rider for a full minute, working out the angle, the pace, the specifics of the horse. A bay with a white sock on the left foreleg. She knew that horse. "Cray," she said. Flat. The name like a stone dropped into still water. Rowan looked. The ranch hand. He's been sent ahead. Silas would have figured we'd aim for Casper. It's the obvious destination. And he'd send someone fast to get there first. Cray moves faster than Silas. Silas would have set out on the main road and sent Cray to cut us off. She calculated. He doesn't see us yet. The angle's not right. "How sure are you?" Sure enough. She was already looking at the terrain around them. "There's a dry wash half a mile east. I don't know how deep, but the banks will hide us if we move now and keep below the sightline." If he already knows the territory, he doesn't. Cray's been with Silas 3 years, and he grew up in Nebraska. He knows the roads, not the land. She looked at Rowan. "I know the land." He made the decision in about 2 seconds. Lead. She led. The dry wash was deeper than she'd hoped and shallower than she'd feared, about 4 feet at the deepest point, with banks that crumbled at the lip but held if you stayed 6 inches back. They went in at a careful angle and moved east with the horse walking slow enough to avoid noise on the loose rock bed, and she watched the top of the bank and listened. She heard Cray's horse at what she estimated was 200 yards. The sound came across flat ground with a clarity that the wash magnified, and she stopped walking and put her hand back, and Rowan stopped too. The horse's hooves on hard ground, rhythmic and steady, and then a pause, a longer pause. She did not breathe loudly. The hoofbeats resumed, moving north, moving toward Casper, which meant Cray was going ahead of them, which meant he hadn't spotted them, which meant Silas's forward man was going to arrive in Casper before they did. She let out the breath. "He'll go to the sheriff," she said quietly. "Silas will have told him exactly what to say. Stolen property, runaway wife, probably adds something about the man who helped her." "What will they say about me?" "Whatever's most useful. Depends on whether Silas has learned your name." "He might. I've been in the territory long enough that people know me." A pause. "Might know I work for Porter." She looked at him. "Would that be worse or better?" "For Silas, considerably worse. For the next hour, possibly more complicated." She thought through the revised picture. If Silas knew Rowan worked for Porter, he'd understand immediately that this wasn't just a wife who'd run. It was an investigation that had gotten to his front door. His response would be faster and more organized than she'd calculated for the straightforward version. "How long does Porter need?" she asked. "Once he has the papers, how long before he can file something that gives us legal standing?" "Depends on what's there." He glanced at the documents against her ribs. If what you described in the ledger is what it looks like, he could file for an injunction on the existing land transfers within a day. Formal charges take longer. But an injunction, if the judge signs it, changes everything. Silas can't transfer or destroy anything. Which judge? Porter uses Harlan. District judge, been on the bench 12 years. She filed the name. Not in Silas's pocket. Harlan and Silas Boone have never had dealings as far as Porter knows. "As far as Porter knows," she repeated. "Yes." She didn't say anything else about it. As far as Porter knows was going to have to be good enough because she didn't have a better option, and standing in a dry wash north of Casper inventing obstacles wasn't a strategy. "We need to get to Porter before Cray gets to the sheriff," she said, "or at least close enough that the sheriff's first move doesn't have time to matter. Porter's office is on 2nd Street. If Cray goes to the sheriff's office first, which he will, that gives us maybe 20 minutes after he arrives. Then we move." She looked up the bank. "We come out east and come into town from the north side. Cray will have come in from the south. That's the main road. It avoids his return path if he circles back looking for us. North side it is." They came out of the wash and cut east and then north, and the town came toward them gradually. A water tower first, then rooftops, then the sounds of a working town, wagons and voices, and the particular clatter of commerce that Mabel had not heard in its full form since she'd married Silas, and moved out to the homestead where the only sounds were the ones Silas allowed or produced. The north end of Casper was quieter than the main street. A few houses, a feed store, a livery at the corner. Rowan left the horse at the livery without explanation and paid for 2 hours, and they walked from there, and she walked beside him on the boardwalk and felt the particular self-consciousness of being looked at on a street after 2 years of near total isolation from streets and their populations. People looked. She was aware of it. The glances, the assessments. A woman her size in a torn skirt with scraped palms and a 2-day travel look about her drew notice. She kept her chin level and her pace steady and thought about Clara Harmon, who had moved through the world like she had earned the space she occupied and didn't require anyone's confirmation of it. 2nd Street was 2 blocks south and 1 east. Porter's office had a painted sign, Aldous Porter, attorney at law, that had weathered enough to tell her it had been there a while. The door was unlocked. They went in. The front room had 2 chairs, a desk with no one at it, and a door to the inner office that was partially open. From inside came the sound of papers being moved and someone muttering to themselves in the focused, irritated way of a person in the middle of a complicated task. "Porter," Rowan said toward the door. The muttering stopped. A pause. Then, "Mercer? I wasn't expecting you until..." The door opened, and the man who came through it was not what she expected, which she recognized was an irrational thing to have an expectation about. But she had built some picture of him from Rowan's description, and the picture hadn't been this. A compact man of about 60 with thick gray eyebrows and an ink stain on his right hand, and the look of someone who had been sitting in the same chair for 6 hours and had stopped noticing it. He looked at Rowan. He looked at her. He looked at the documents she was holding. "Sit down," he said, and he was already going back into the inner office for a 3rd chair. She sat across from his desk and put the papers and ledger on the surface in front of him, and he looked at them without touching them and looked at her. "Who are you?" he said. Not rude, just immediate. "Mabel Boone. Before that, Mabel Ashcroft. I've been married to Silas Boone for 2 years, and I manage his household accounts for most of that." Porter looked at Rowan. She knows more about his operation than anyone I've found in 8 months, Rowan said, and she brought the documentation out herself. Porter looked at the papers. From where? A locked strongbox under the floor of the bedroom, she said. I knew its location. I've seen the contents before. These are the originals. You removed them from the property? Yes. His property. Our property, she said. I'm his wife. The household... Yes, I know the argument. He waved a hand. Not dismissive, actually. More like he'd already worked through it and was past the step she was on. It's defensible, and more importantly, it becomes irrelevant the moment we establish what these documents contain. He looked at her. Tell me what they contain. In your own words, from your direct observation. Don't tell me what you think they mean. Tell me what you saw. She told him. She told him methodically, deed by deed, date by date, the discrepancy in the ink on the 2 undated documents, the witness signatures appearing across multiple transactions, the ledger with its distribution columns and the initial codes and the recent escalation in amounts. She spoke for about 15 minutes without interruption, and Porter listened without writing anything down, which she initially found alarming and then understood was because he was listening at a level where writing would have been a distraction. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the first deed. He looked at it the way she had looked at it, not skimming, but reading, actually reading, and then looking at the margins and then going to the second deed and comparing. He worked through 3 of them that way before he looked up. The ink differentiation, he said. Can you describe it again? The specific deeds. She described them again. He made a note. The ledger, these initials. Your identification of JC as a Callaway in the land registry. What basis do you have for that? A piece of correspondence that came to the house addressed to Silas. It had a letterhead from the Natrona County Land Registry. The signatory was a J. Callaway. Silas put it away quickly. You read it first. I read it before he saw me looking. What did it say? It referenced a transaction number that matched one of the deed numbers I saw in the strongbox on a prior occasion. It was written in a way that assumed shared knowledge, the way you write to someone who already understands the context. Not a formal inquiry, a coordination. She paused. I didn't understand the full significance at the time. I understood it was something Silas didn't want me to see. Porter set down the ledger. He looked at Rowan. When did you last contact me? 3 weeks ago. I wrote from Glen Rock. And you've been out of contact since. I was following leads south. Didn't want to use a courier I wasn't sure of. Porter picked up the ledger again, turned to the final pages, the recent entries with the elevated numbers. He looked at them for a long time. They're wrapping up, he said. That's what I thought too, Mabel said. He looked at her. She had the sense of being reassessed. Not harshly, but completely. The way a man reassesses a situation when a piece of information arrives that changes the architecture. How long do you think they've been planning to move on? The escalation started about 8 weeks ago. If they're distributing at this level and planning an exit, I'd guess they want to be done within the month. Which means the filings, if they're going to happen, need to happen within the week. He looked at the documents at the spread of them across his desk. I can file for an emergency injunction today. I need to reach Judge Harlan before the close of business. He looked at the window. Late afternoon light, still time. Mercer, you need to make yourself visible in this office until I'm back. Anyone comes asking... Cray, Mabel said. Silas's ranch hand. He came ahead of us. He'll be at the sheriff by now. Porter's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it sharpened. Which sheriff? Dunmore? I don't know the sheriff's name. He came to dinner twice. Dunmore, Rowan said. He's had dealings with Silas. Yes, he has. Porter said it flatly, with the tone of a man who had been aware of that particular dealing for some time and had been waiting for a moment when it mattered. Dunmore can't touch these papers once Harlan signs, and Harlan will sign. He stood up. I need you to stay here, both of you. Do not go out. If someone comes to this door, you do not answer it. He looked at Mabel directly. I understand that's uncomfortable given your recent experience of being told what to do. She looked back at him. Tell me why and I'll do it. Because you are the primary witness and you are currently in possession of the only material evidence for a case I have been building for 8 months, and if Dunmore gets to you before Harlan signs, the next 24 hours become significantly more difficult. He held her gaze. Is that sufficient? Yes, she said. He took his hat and coat and went out. The office was quiet. Mabel looked at the papers still spread across Porter's desk, the evidence she had carried against her ribs through a creek and a dark field and 12 miles of canyon road, and felt the particular flatness of a moment after sustained motion. The body still expecting urgency, the situation briefly not requiring it, the gap between those two things producing an exhaustion that hit all at once. Rowan was looking at the door. "He'll get Harlan," he said. Whether he was saying it for her benefit or his own, she couldn't tell. He seemed certain. He's certain about a lot of things. He's been right about most of them. A pause. He's also wrong sometimes. He was wrong about how quickly this was going to resolve. He thought it would take another 3 months. What changed his timeline? Rowan looked at her. "You did." She didn't answer that. Looked back at the papers. The light in the office shifted. A cloud, something passing over the sun, and the room went briefly dimmer, and in the dimness she could hear the street outside. Wagons, voices, the ordinary noise of a town going about its late afternoon, and under it, after a minute of listening, the specific sound of boots on the boardwalk outside the door. Unhurried, deliberate, 2 sets of feet. She looked at Rowan. He was already at the side of the window, looking out at an angle that wouldn't put him in view from the street. "Dunmore," he said quietly, "and someone I don't know, not Cray." She stood. "Stay back from the window," he said. "I know." She was already moving the papers, gathering them quickly, bundling them, looking around the office for a place that wasn't the obvious desk surface. She found Porter's lower cabinet, unlocked, and put the papers and ledger inside and pushed it shut. Then she went back to her chair and sat down and put her hands in her lap. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A knock. Heavy, the knock of someone who considered it a formality. Rowan was still at the window, out of the direct line of the door. He looked at her. She looked at the door. The knock came again. "Mr. Porter," a voice said from outside. "Sheriff Dunmore, I have some questions for the people inside." She sat very still, her hands in her lap, the cabinet 3 feet to her right with everything in it. She thought about Silas's boot on the bucket, about the particular quality of his quiet voice, about 2 years of being afraid in ways she'd had to hide, afraid in ways that would not be believed, afraid in a house where the walls absorbed everything and gave back nothing. She thought about Daniel Wick's son and the shoe buckle at the county gathering. She thought about Clara Harmon. "You'll figure out your worth eventually." The sheriff knocked a 3rd time. Rowan looked at her. His expression was not telling her what to do. It was waiting to see what she decided. She stood up, walked to the door. She opened it. Dunmore was a wide man in his 50s with a badge that caught the late afternoon light and eyes that did the quick assessment she recognized. The look that categorized her in approximately 1 second and filed the category under "not a problem," which was the assessment men like Dunmore made about women like her approximately 100% of the time, and which was therefore the most useful thing she had going for her right now. "Ma'am," he said, the word a formality. His attention moved immediately past her to the room behind her, looking for Rowan, finding him, shifting into a different mode. "Can I help you?" she said. The sheriff looked at her again, taking her in more carefully this time, revising his first read. "You're Mabel Boone." "I am." "Your husband filed a complaint this afternoon. Reports property was taken from his home without consent." He said it carefully, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had rehearsed the version that didn't technically choose a side. "I need to ask you some questions." She looked at him steadily. "I'm happy to answer questions," she said. "Mr. Porter is my attorney, and he should be back within the hour. I'd prefer to have him present." Dunmore's eyes flicked to Rowan, back to her. "That's your right," he said, with the tone of a man acknowledging a right he'd hoped wouldn't be invoked. "But I'd like the 2 of you to come down to my office and wait there until he returns." "We're comfortable here," she said. "Ma'am, I'm not asking—" "I understand that," she said, "but I am asking, we'll wait here for Mr. Porter. When he returns, we'll all have a conversation." She held his gaze. "Unless you're placing me under arrest, Sheriff, in which case I'd need to know the specific charge." The second man behind Dunmore, she didn't know him, dressed in a suit that wasn't quite the right fit, something slightly off about the way he was positioned, shifted his weight. She didn't look at him directly. She kept her eyes on Dunmore. The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. Then he looked at the office behind her, and she could see him calculating what he was likely to find in there and whether he had basis to look, and what Porter would do to him in court if he went in without basis. And she could see all of it in the particular compression around his eyes. "I'll be back," he said. "Mr. Porter will be here," she said. Dunmore put his hat back on and left. The second man followed without having spoken. She closed the door. Her hands, she noticed when she looked at them, were shaking. Not badly. Just the particular fine tremor of a body that had been running on controlled adrenaline for 36 hours and had just spent it all in approximately 2 minutes of standing in a doorway. Rowan was looking at her. "That was well done," he said. "Don't," she said, not harshly. "I'll fall apart if you say something nice right now. Give me a minute." He said nothing. She sat back down, put her hands flat on her thighs, and breathed. The shaking settled after about 30 seconds, the way these things did when you stopped fighting them and just let them run through. "The man behind him," she said. "Do you know him?" "No, not local. I know most of the local faces someone brought in. By Silas or by whoever's above Silas. Yes." He came away from the window and sat back down across from her. "Porter needs to come back soon." "He will," she said. She said it the way you say something when you're not entirely certain and certainty is what's required. She said it, and she held it, and she looked at the cabinet with the papers inside and thought about Judge Harlan and an emergency injunction and what it would mean for Silas to wake up tomorrow in a world where a court had already moved against him. She thought about that image, Silas's face when he realized it, and held on to it the way she used to hold on to the image of leaving, the general shape of a different future, through the mornings when nothing else was available to hold. Outside, the town continued its ordinary sounds, indifferent and ongoing, and the light on the window shifted toward evening, and she waited. Porter came back 47 minutes after he left. She knew it was 47 minutes because she had been counting. Not precisely, not with a clock, but in the way she'd learned to count time in a house where knowing how long Silas had been gone was a practical survival skill. She'd developed a rhythm for it, something she did without deciding to. Her internal sense of elapsed time fairly accurate within 5 minutes either direction. Rowan had not spoken much while they waited. He'd checked the window twice more, moved to examine the lock on the back office door, returned to his chair. She'd appreciated the silence. It was the right kind. The kind that understood she was thinking, that didn't try to fill itself with reassurance. When the front door opened and Porter came through it, the first thing she read was his face, because that was always the first thing. That was information that arrived before words did. His face said it had worked, but it had not been easy, and there were complications he hadn't expected. "Harlan signed," he said, before he'd fully cleared the threshold. She released a breath. "It took some doing." He put his hat on the desk, then thought better of it and put it on the chair instead, then moved the papers she'd reorganized and sat down. He looked older than he had 47 minutes ago, which was the particular aging that came not from years, but from the specific expenditure of effort. He had questions about the origin of the documents. I had to argue the marital access point longer than I expected. He's a careful man. "But he signed," Rowan said. "He signed. The injunction freezes all property transfers associated with the 6 parcels named in those deeds, effective immediately. It also prohibits the destruction of any financial records related to those transactions." Porter opened a leather case and produced a document. She could see the judge's seal from where she sat. "Silas Boone cannot sell, transfer, mortgage, or destroy anything related to those properties as of 1 hour ago." She looked at the sealed document. 2 years of the shape of a different future, and it was a piece of paper with a stamp on it. She didn't know why she'd expected something more dramatic. That was how it worked. That was always how it worked. The most significant moments arrived in ordinary containers. "Dunmore was here," Rowan said. Porter looked at him, then at her. "What happened?" "He knocked," I answered. "He wanted us to come to his office and wait. I declined and told him we'd speak when you returned." She paused. "He wasn't happy about it." Porter looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "You told Dunmore no." "I told him I preferred to wait for my attorney." Something shifted in Porter's face. Not quite a smile, more the suppression of one. "He'll be back." Now that Harlan has signed, Dunmore's position is considerably more complicated. He can't act against this injunction without openly defying a sitting judge. He set the document down, but he'll try to make things difficult in other ways. Men like Dunmore don't stop. They just adjust their method. "What does Silas know?" Mabel asked. "Right now, at this moment, what has Dunmore told him?" "I don't know specifically. I know that Silas was in town, arrived about 2 hours ago, which means he rode hard after you left. He went to Dunmore first. Then he went to an office on Main Street that I believe belongs to a business associate." Porter's eyes were on her. "Do you know who Silas does business with in Casper? Regular contacts, not official ones?" She thought. "He mentioned a man named Garrett twice in the past year. didn't say what Garrett did. The name came up in the context of arrangements being made, things going smoothly, things being handled. Once he said Garrett had taken care of a problem with a county clerk. Porter wrote the name. What else? He received a telegram 8 weeks ago that he read in the barn instead of the house, which was unusual. He didn't care if I saw the ordinary correspondence. He just put it away quickly. Something he didn't want me near. She paused. The timing matches the escalation in the ledger. 8 weeks ago. Porter wrote something else. That's consistent with what I've been tracking. There was a significant land transaction filed in Natrona County 7 weeks ago, a parcel that transferred under circumstances that didn't hold together when I looked at them. I've been trying to establish the connection. It's in the ledger, she said. Second to last page. The amount is larger than the others. It's the entry that first caught my attention when I was working through the totals. He went to the ledger, turned to the page she described, and looked. She watched his expression as he read. His eyebrows did a complicated thing. Mabel, he said, first time he'd used her name. This entry here, the notation in the third column, this isn't an initial, this is an abbreviation. She leaned forward and looked at where he was pointing. She had read it as initials. TMH. 3 letters the same as the others. But the way he was looking at it, the way his finger was positioned, it's an entity, she said, seeing it at the same moment. Not a person, a company, or an office. Territorial Mining Holdings, Porter said quietly. They are a land acquisition company operating out of Cheyenne. They've been filing claims across 3 territories for the past 4 years. He set the ledger down carefully, the way you set something down when you suddenly understand it might be more fragile than it appeared. Silas Boone has not been the operation. He's been one of their acquisition agents. The room was very quiet. How large is this company? Rowan said. Large enough that I've heard the name before and been unable to find anyone willing to talk about them on record. Porter looked at the ledger. If this is what I think it is, the fraud case is not a county matter. It's a territorial matter, potentially federal. Mabel looked at the 3 letters in the ledger column. She'd counted them as one entry among many, no different from the other initials. She'd spent 2 years in a house where those letters represented something she hadn't known to look for. Federal, she said. That means a different court. Different court, different jurisdiction, different timeline. Porter stood up and walked to the window, which was something she was beginning to understand he did when he was working through implications he hadn't fully mapped yet. The injunction Harlan signed covers the county-level fraud. That stands. But if TMH is involved, the county filing is the beginning, not the end. Does it change what happens to Silas? It makes his position worse. He's no longer just the man who defrauded 6 families. He's an agent of a larger conspiracy, which means prosecutors will want him cooperative, which means he has incentive to give them the people above him. Porter turned from the window, which means he becomes significantly more dangerous to those people very quickly. She worked through that. They'll want to move against him before he has the chance to cooperate. Yes, which means we have less time than we thought. Correct. Rowan was already on his feet. The 3 of them looked at each other across the office in the particular way of people who have just recalculated the ground they're standing on and found it smaller than they thought. Who else needs to know tonight? Rowan asked Porter. I need to reach a colleague in Cheyenne, a federal contact I've used before. I need to do it by telegraph, which means the telegraph office, which means being visible. He looked at Rowan. And I need someone to find Daniel Wick. He's the closest witness with direct experience of the fraud, and if things move as fast as I now think they might, I'll need a supporting affidavit before morning. Wick is 3 hours north, Rowan said. I know where Wick is. Porter looked at Mabel. You'll stay here. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone who isn't me or Mercer. He stopped. Unless it's Dunmore with an actual warrant, in which case let him in and say nothing. I understand. I mean nothing, Mabel. Not a word about TMH. Not a word about federal jurisdiction. Whatever you know, you discovered it with me present. Anything you say alone becomes his version. I understand, she said again. Porter looked at her one more moment. That reassessment expression she was getting used to. And then he and Rowan left, Porter out the front and Rowan through the back, and she was alone in the office with the locked door and the injunction on the desk and the ledger and all 6 deeds and the full weight of what she was sitting in the middle of. She got up and locked the front door, went to the back and found a bolt she could throw, came back and sat down at Porter's desk because it was the position from which she could see both doors, which was a habit of sitting she'd developed in the Boone house and which she suspected would take a long time to leave her. She looked at the papers. Then she picked up Porter's pen and a blank sheet from the desk and began to write. Not for Porter, not for the filing. She wrote because there were things in her head that needed to be organized before they slipped into the less precise territory of memory, and because writing had always been the way she made something permanent that might otherwise become less than it was. She wrote out the ledger entries in full, every date, every amount, every initial, from memory, because the ledger was evidence, and evidence needed to stay intact and clean, and she might be the only person who could reconstruct it if something happened to the physical pages. She wrote the deed numbers and the discrepancies she'd noted. She wrote the name of the county gathering where she'd seen Daniel Wick's son, the date, the names she remembered, the context. She wrote for almost 2 hours. By the end of it, her hand ached and she had filled 9 pages, and the candle Porter kept on the desk was considerably shorter than it had been. The knock came at 9:15. She sat very still. Listened for voices outside. Heard one, then a second, and recognized the second after a moment as Rowan's. She unlocked the front door. Rowan came in, and behind him was a man she hadn't met, middle 50s, weathered in the particular way of someone who had done outdoor work for most of his adult life, wearing clothes that were clean but showed the kind of honest wear that didn't come from one long ride. He looked at her directly when he came through the door, and something in his expression shifted, a recognition, though they'd never spoken. "Daniel Wick," Rowan said. "Mrs. Boone," the man said. His voice was careful. "Mabel," she said. "Please." He nodded. He looked at the desk, at the spread of papers. He looked at the injunction with Harlan's seal. He stood very still for a moment, in the way of a man who has been waiting a long time for something and is not quite sure how to be in the room with it now that it's arrived. "My youngest," he said, "at the county gathering, you fixed his buckle." "I remember. He talked about it for a week." He sat down in the chair across from the desk. "I should have done something then. I knew what Silas was. Knew the shape of it, not the details. I told myself there was nothing to be done." His hands were on his knees. "I told myself a lot of things." "You told Rowan to find me," she said. "Took me long enough." She looked at him for a moment, thought about saying something about the cost of timing, about how the decisions people made when they were afraid weren't really decisions in the clean sense. They were survivals. They were the best available movement in a constrained space. She thought about saying that. She decided it wasn't her thing to say to him. He knew what it had cost. He didn't need her to characterize it. "Porter needs your affidavit," she said instead. "The terms of the loan Silas called early. The notice period. Every specific you can remember." "I remember all of it." He said it with the flatness of someone who had been remembering something they'd prefer to forget for 2 years. 30 days notice on a $400 loan against 40 acres that assessed for $1,100. He had a document he said I'd signed as a condition of the loan. I hadn't signed it, but my name was on it. "That document, is it in the ledger?" She checked, found the entry by date and amount, the initialed columns. In the margin, a notation she'd read before and not fully parsed. A small number that she now understood was a document reference number. "It'll be in what he kept elsewhere," she said. "Not in this box. These were the deeds and distributions. He'd keep the loan documents with the official records, but the reference number is here." She wrote it on a separate sheet and handed it to Wick. "This is what Porter will need to subpoena." Wick looked at the number. "You worked this all out from his papers." "I worked his accounts for 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. "He used to tell people his wife wasn't sharp enough for numbers." He said it with something in his voice that wasn't quite anger, angrier than disappointment, more tired than rage. "Used to laugh about it at the feed store, at the county meetings, said she was a good woman, but she couldn't count past 10 without her fingers." She'd heard this before, secondhand, through the particular way rumors about yourself arrive back to you, filtered through the expressions of people who didn't realize you were listening, through comments Silas made at home that assumed she hadn't heard the same things outside it. She'd heard it and she'd filed it, the same way she filed everything, in the long, patient record of things she was aware of that Silas had assumed she wasn't. "He was wrong," she said, simply, without heat. Yes, he was. Wick looked at the 9 pages she'd filled with reconstructed data. "What is all that?" "Backup," she said, "in case something happens to the originals." He looked at her for a moment. "You did all that from memory?" "I've had a long time to memorize them." Porter came back just before 10. He was accompanied by a man she hadn't seen before, younger, 30s, with a leather case and the specific posture of someone accustomed to moving quickly between one significant conversation and the next. Porter introduced him as Marcus Webb, a federal land agent who had been working in Wyoming Territory for the past year and who had, it emerged within the first 5 minutes of conversation, been tracking territorial mining holdings from the Cheyenne End for approximately 6 months. Webb looked at the ledger the way Porter had looked at it, with the concentration of someone seeing something they'd been looking for in a form they hadn't expected. He turned pages slowly, careful with the edges, and when he reached the TMH entries, he stopped and didn't move for almost a minute. "Where did you get this?" he said. "She did," Porter said, meaning Mabel. Webb looked at her. "From inside the Boone property?" "From a locked strongbox under the bedroom floor," she said. "Yes." "You identified the entries as territorial mining holdings. Porter identified TMH. I identified the pattern in the distribution column that showed a senior party receiving 40% across all transactions." Webb set the ledger down. He looked at Porter. "This, combined with what I've been building in Cheyenne, is enough to go federal." He looked back at Mabel. "Is there anything else in these papers, anything you haven't mentioned yet, that connects to TMH specifically? A name, a correspondence, a reference number?" She thought about the 9 pages she'd written. "There's a notation in the ledger margin on the entry dated April 3rd of this year, a sequence of letters and numbers I didn't fully parse at the time." She opened the ledger to the page, found the notation. "I thought it was a personal code of Silas's, but if TMH uses a filing system..." Webb looked at the notation. She watched his face. Something happened there. A compression, a controlled version of a reaction he was clearly practiced at containing. "That's a TMH internal account reference," he said. "That's their numbering system." He looked at Porter. "This places Boone inside their internal accounting. He wasn't just an agent, he was formally incorporated into their books." "Which means they'll have reciprocal records," Porter said, "which means when we subpoena their books, Boone shows up in them." Webb closed the ledger carefully. "He's not going to be able to claim he was a private actor operating outside their knowledge." The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that. Then Rowan said, from the chair he'd taken near the back door, "Silas is still in town." Everyone looked at him. "I saw his horse outside the hotel on my way back. He's staying." Rowan looked at Mabel. "Which means tomorrow morning he's going to know about the injunction, if he doesn't already. And he's going to know what it means." "He'll go to Dunmore," Porter said. "Dunmore can't move against the injunction," Webb said. "And once I file a federal notice tomorrow morning, Dunmore becomes irrelevant." "Dunmore can still make things complicated between now and tomorrow morning," Rowan said. "Then we make sure tomorrow morning comes quickly," Porter said. He looked at Webb. "Can you file by 7? "I can file by 6 if I start drafting now." "Then start drafting." Porter looked at Wick. "I need your affidavit tonight, an hour of your time." "You have it," Wick said. Porter looked at Mabel. There was something in his expression she was learning to read, the look of a man who was about to say something he'd assessed carefully for accuracy before saying, "You've done more in the last 36 hours than most witnesses manage in 6 months of formal process. The case we're building tonight," he stopped. "I want you to understand what you've made possible." "I understand it," she said. "Let's make sure it holds." He nodded. Moved to his drafting materials. The office filled with the sounds of working. Pen on paper. The quiet negotiation of Webb and Porter over language. Wick's steady voice answering Porter's questions in careful chronological order. Mabel took the 9 reconstructed pages she'd written and handed them to Webb as a working reference. He looked at them, looked at her, and said nothing for a moment. "You wrote all this tonight," he said. "From memory," she said. "Cross-reference it against the originals. If anything doesn't match, tell me. But I don't think anything won't." He used the pages. She stayed at the desk and helped where she could. When Porter needed a specific date confirmed, she confirmed it. When Webb needed the sequence of a particular set of entries, she walked him through it. When Wick's memory on the loan terms blurred at the edges, she had the ledger entry that corroborated the amounts and timing. It was nearly 1 in the morning when Silas walked into the street outside the office window. She saw him because she was the one facing the window, and she saw him because she had spent 2 years learning to track him by peripheral awareness. Where he was, which direction he was moving, how he was carrying himself, what that carriage communicated about his state. He was standing in the middle of 2nd Street, with Dunmore beside him and the suited stranger from earlier, and one other man she didn't know, and he was looking at Porter's window with the specific stillness she recognized, his planning face. "He's outside," she said. The room went quiet. Porter and Rowan came to the window, carefully, not presenting themselves to the glass, and looked. Silas stood in the street for approximately 1 minute. Then he said something to Dunmore. Then he walked back toward the hotel. Dunmore looked at Porter's window for a moment longer before he followed. "He knows," Rowan said. "He's known since this afternoon," Porter said. "He knows Harlan's signed. He's counting what he has left." He moved back to his drafting. Let him count. By the time he finishes, Webb will have filed. She watched the empty street where Silas had been standing. Tried to read what he'd communicated to Dunmore in those few words. Tried to determine whether what she'd seen was resignation or recalculation. Whether the planning face was planning for departure or for something else. She couldn't tell. 2 years of studying him, and this version of him, the one with the ground shifting under the empire he'd built, was new enough that she didn't have a reference for it. That was new too, she realized, not knowing what Silas was going to do next. For 2 years she'd known. She'd read him so precisely and so constantly that she could anticipate him in her sleep, could feel the weather of his moods before they broke. And now, for the first time, she genuinely didn't know, which meant the territory between them had changed. She went back to the desk. Webb had a question about the 3rd deed. She answered it. Porter needed a date. She had it. Wick was describing the morning Silas's man had arrived with the loan call notice, and the words he'd used, and the expression on his face, and the paper he'd presented. She listened to all of it and added what she could and did not look at the window again. The night ground on. The candle shortened. Webb's pages grew. Wick's voice became slower with tiredness, but didn't stop. Porter wrote with the steadiness of a man who had been doing this for 25 years and understood that pace and accuracy mattered more than speed, even when speed was what the situation seemed to demand. Rowan brought water at some point, and she drank it, and he sat back down, and outside the window the street was quiet and dark, and eventually she stopped listening for Silas's boots on the boardwalk. Not because she'd stopped being afraid. Because fear, she had decided somewhere around midnight, was not the point. Fear was what you felt. What you did was separate from what you felt, and the two did not have to match. Somewhere past 2 a.m, Webb set his pen down and said, "It's ready." Porter looked at the document, read through it in silence, made 2 small corrections, handed it back. "File at 6, he said. "I'll be there at 5:30, Webb said. She looked at the papers on the desk. The originals, the reconstructed pages, Webb's federal notice, Porter's injunction with Harlan's seal, Wick's affidavit. Everything that had been scattered and separate and hidden was now organized and connected and on the record, and in a few hours it would be in front of a federal authority that Silas Boone could not call in a favor from. Wick stood and stretched and looked at her. "My family had that land for 11 years, he said. "Built the house ourselves. First winter we nearly—" He stopped, started again. "I thought it was gone." She looked at him steadily. Didn't tell him it would definitely be all right, because she didn't know that, because the process ahead was long and complicated, and she was honest enough to know that legal processes did not always conclude the way they should. But she looked at him and he looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't require words, the specific understanding between 2 people who have both been through the machinery of someone else's power and come out the other side still standing. "Get some sleep," Porter told her. "There's a boarding house on 3rd Street, Mrs. Halverson's. Tell her I sent you." She stood, looked at the desk, at all of it. "Those papers," she said. "I'll keep them in my safe tonight," Porter said. "I've had a safe for 25 years that Dunmore has no legal access to and has been trying to open by other means for about 6 of them." He almost smiled. He hasn't managed it yet. She picked up the 9 reconstructed pages and handed them directly to Porter. "Keep those with the originals," she said. "They're a complete cross-reference from memory. If anything happens to the documents, those pages can establish what was in them." He took them, looked at her over the rims of his glasses, which she hadn't noticed him put on until this moment. "I've had clients bring me partial evidence, incomplete records, damaged documents, second-hand accounts." He paused. "I've never had a client walk through my door with evidence this complete." She put on her coat. "Silas thought I was slow," she said. "It's the most useful mistake he ever made." She left the office with Rowan walking beside her and the night air cold and clear after hours in the close warmth of that room, and behind them the office window showed a warm square of light where Porter was already looking at the documents again, making sure everything held, which was the work you did when the work mattered. She did not feel victorious. She felt tired and sore and uncertain about the morning in ways she couldn't fully list. But underneath all of that was something quieter and more durable. The sense of having done the specific thing that the situation required, with the specific skills she happened to have in the window of time that happened to be available. Tomorrow, Silas would wake up in his hotel room to a world with a federal notice in it. She could live with that while she waited for what came next. She slept 4 hours at Mrs. Halverson's boarding house, which was 4 more than she'd expected and fewer than her body wanted. And when she woke, the ceiling of the small room was gray with early light, and she lay still for a moment, the way she'd learned to lie still in the Boone house. Listening first, taking inventory of the sounds, determining what the morning was before she moved into it. What she heard was ordinary: a wagon on the street below, someone in the kitchen downstairs, the particular rhythm of breakfast being made. A door somewhere in the building opening and closing with the casual confidence of someone who had every right to be where they were. No boots on the porch, no particular silence that wasn't just silence. She got up. The dress she'd been wearing for 2 days was beyond what a night's rest could repair, and Mrs. Halverson, a compact woman in her 60s who had taken one look at Mabel in the doorway the previous night and asked no questions, which itself was a form of kindness, had left a folded set of clothes outside her door some time before dawn. They weren't new, and they weren't a perfect fit, but they were clean, and they were offered without comment, which was the part that mattered. She dressed, went downstairs. Mrs. Halverson was in the kitchen and put a plate in front of her without asking what she wanted, which was eggs and bread and a cup of coffee that was stronger than what she'd been making on the Boone homestead because Silas had opinions about the cost of coffee and she'd learned to make it weak enough that he didn't complain. She drank it black and didn't say anything about it, and Mrs. Halverson moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a boarding house long enough that she'd stopped noticing the effort of it. "That attorney's man came by at 6, Mrs. Halverson said, not looking up from the stove. "Said to tell you the filing went through." Mabel set the cup down. "Said you'd know what that meant," Mrs. Halverson added. "I do," Mabel said. "Thank you." She finished the eggs and went out into the morning. Casper at 7 in the morning was a working town doing what working towns did, moving, producing, organizing itself for the day ahead. She walked the 2 blocks to Porter's office and found the door already unlocked and Porter already at his desk, which suggested he had not slept at all or had slept somewhere in the office, neither of which would have surprised her. Rowan was in the chair by the window. He looked at her when she came in and said nothing, which was how she'd come to understand he communicated that things were currently stable. Not fine necessarily, but not immediately alarming. "Webb filed at 5:53, Porter said. "Federal notice is on the record. I've also sent a copy of the injunction to Harlan's clerk for the public filing, which means it's a matter of official record as of this morning." He looked at her over his glasses. Silas Boone cannot move against any of those 6 properties. He cannot transfer assets, cannot liquidate accounts tied to the named transactions, cannot leave the territory without notifying the federal court. "He knows this by now," she said. "He will within the hour. Webb is delivering formal notice to the hotel." Porter looked at his papers. "Which brings us to the part of the morning I want you prepared for." She sat down. "Tell me." Silas has 2 options. He can engage an attorney and attempt to challenge the injunction, which will fail because the evidence is solid, but which will buy him time and make the next 6 months uncomfortable for everyone. Or he can cooperate with Webb's federal investigation in exchange for a reduced accounting of his role. Porter set his pen down. If he cooperates, it accelerates everything. The people above him become the primary targets. His situation becomes not good, but survivable. He goes from the center of the prosecution to a peripheral figure. She looked at him steadily. "You're telling me he might not face the full consequences?" "I'm telling you that's a possibility, that the federal interest is in TMH, in the larger operation, and Silas is a means to that end, not the end itself." Porter held her gaze. "I want you to know that before it happens rather than after." She sat with that for a moment. She thought about Silas's boot on the bucket, about her hair in his fist, about the coffee tin and 14 months of careful saving, about the specific quality of his voice when it went quiet. She thought about the 6 families, Daniel Wick and his 40 acres, the Harmon property where Clara had told her she'd figure out her worth, 5 other families she'd never met whose names were in the ledger as entries in someone else's accounting of what they were owed. "What matters," she said finally, "is that the land goes back, that the people who lost it get it back. What happens to Silas after that?" She stopped. "It matters. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't, but it's not the only thing." Porter nodded. She thought he'd been checking whether she understood the difference between justice as a concept and justice as a process, which were not always the same shape. "There's one more thing," Rowan said from the window. She looked at him. "Silas is in the street." She stood. Not fast. Deliberately. With her full height, which she had been doing since she was a child and which Silas had spent 2 years trying to reduce in her, trying to make her take up less space, move with the apologetic shrinking of a person who understood they were an inconvenience. She stood up straight and went to the window and looked. He was across the street. He had Dunmore with him and his attorney. She recognized the attorney from a county meeting, a man named Spence who handled land cases and who was going to have a difficult morning. And he was looking at Porter's office the way he had looked at it from the street the night before, that same stillness. But something had changed in it. She could see it even at this distance, even through glass. The slight wrongness of a man whose confidence had been the structural load-bearing element of his entire way of moving through the world, and who was now feeling that confidence shift under him. He wasn't panicking. He was too controlled for that. But the stillness was different. It was the stillness of someone holding something together rather than the stillness of someone who simply was. Webb appeared from the direction of the hotel and walked toward Silas with a document in his hand. The conversation that followed lasted about 3 minutes, which was how long it took Webb to deliver the formal notice and answer the 2 or 3 questions Spence would have insisted on asking. Mabel watched Silas's face the whole time. She watched him receive the information about the federal filing, watched Spence read the document, watched the moment when Spence said something in Silas's ear that changed the angle of Silas's shoulders by approximately 2 degrees. That was the moment. The moment Silas understood that this was no longer the story he'd been telling himself since yesterday. Runaway wife, stolen property, a matter to be handled through Dunmore, and a quiet county process that he had enough fingers in to manage. This was something else. Something that came from a direction he hadn't fully accounted for. He looked out of Porter's window. She didn't step back. For a moment, just a moment, he was looking directly at her. She wasn't sure he could see her clearly through the glass at that distance, but the direction of his gaze was precise enough that it didn't matter. She looked back. 2 years of looking away. 2 years of the specific muscle memory of making herself smaller in his eyeline, of finding something else to focus on when his attention landed on her, because direct eye contact was the kind of thing that needed to be managed carefully around Silas Boone. She had learned the angles of avoidance the way you learn the angles of a room you live in, without thinking, as pure spatial navigation. She looked back, and she did not look away. He turned and walked toward Spence's office with Dunmore beside him, and that was the last she saw of him that morning. Porter was already at the door behind her. Webb will meet with him this afternoon. Spence will advise cooperation. Spence has enough sense to know when a case is unwinnable, and Silas will listen to Spence because Spence is expensive enough that he respects the opinion. He paused. "It may take a day or 2. These things have their own pace." "I know," she said. They had their own pace, and she was going to have to learn to work within it, and the work was going to be less dramatic than the past 2 days and considerably longer. That was how it actually functioned. Not one decisive moment, but a series of ordinary days inside which the official processes ground forward at the speed that institutions moved, which was never the speed you wanted them to move, but was usually the speed that produced something durable. She understood durable. She'd been building towards something durable for 14 months in a coffee tin. The days that followed had a structure she hadn't expected. Porter asked her to stay in Casper for the duration of the initial process, which she'd anticipated, and offered her the use of a spare room above his office, which she hadn't. She accepted it because she had nowhere else practical to be, and because the practical consideration was enough reason, without needing to examine the gratitude underneath it too closely. She worked. That was the part she hadn't anticipated either. Not that she'd have things to do, but that the things would require exactly her. Porter's process of building the formal case required someone who could read the financial records, identify the relevant entries, explain the relationships between documents and language that would survive a court challenge. He had a clerk, a young man named Ellis, who was fast and methodical. But Ellis had not managed 2 years of Silas Boone's accounts and did not have 14 months of observation behind every entry. She spent 4 days going through everything with Ellis, building the annotated record that Porter needed. She sat at the drafting table in the front room of the office for 8 to 10 hours a day, and she worked. And when Ellis had questions, she answered them. And when Porter needed verification, he came to her and she verified. She was not comfortable with it at first, the being needed, the being the specific person who was required. She kept waiting for the correction, for the moment when Porter would realize she'd misread something or miscalculated, for the version of this where she turned out to be less than what the situation had taken her for. She was aware of this expectation in herself and aware that it came directly from 2 years of being told she was insufficient, and she couldn't turn it off by knowing where it came from. She could only keep working and let the work speak for what it spoke for. On the third day, Ellis looked up from the annotated ledger and said, "I've worked with 3 attorneys in 2 territories, and I have never seen anyone read a financial record like you do." She looked at him. He was 22, possibly 23, with ink on his left hand and the kind of direct sincerity that hadn't yet been worn away by enough experience to make him careful about when he expressed it. "I had a lot of practice," she said. "It's more than practice." He said it without any evident awareness that it was a significant thing to say, which made it more significant. You see the shape of it before you see the numbers, like you know where the wrongness is going to be before you find it. She went back to the ledger, but she sat with what he'd said. On the 5th day, Silas cooperated. Porter told her in the morning the same way he told her most things, directly, without managing her reaction. Spence advised it. Webb confirmed the TMH. Connection is extensive enough that the federal prosecution has no interest in spending resources on the county-level fraud when they can get to the larger operation through Boone's testimony. What does he give them, she asked. Names, specifically the 2 individuals above him in the TMH structure who coordinated the Wyoming operation. Webb's been trying to identify them for 6 months. Silas can walk them through every transaction, every coordination, every meeting. Porter looked at his hands. He's also confirmed the Callaway connection. The JC in the ledger is James Callaway, deputy clerk at the Natrona County Land Registry. He's been placed on administrative suspension pending a separate investigation. She thought about that. James Callaway, who had signed his name as a witness on 3 fraudulent deeds, was going to face an official process. Whether it would be enough was its own question, separate from the question of whether it would happen. The 6 families, she said. The properties. The injunction holds. With Silas cooperating, the process to restore the properties moves significantly faster. Porter's working estimate is 3 to 4 months for the formal restoration on at least 4 of the 6. The other 2 have complications. One has a secondary lien that needs to be unwound. One has a boundary dispute unrelated to the fraud that was pending before the transfer. 3 to 4 months, she said, for 4 of them. The others will take longer. He paused. It's not everything. I want to be honest with you about that. This process will get most of it back for most of the families. It won't be clean and it won't be fast, and there will be a family or 2 who goes through the whole thing and doesn't recover what they're hoping to recover. She nodded. I know, she said. I've known that since the dry wash. He looked at her. It was never going to be everything, she said. That's not how it works. I just needed it to be something. Daniel Wick came into Casper on the 8th day. He came with his wife, a quiet woman named Ruth who shook Mabel's hand with both of hers and held it for a moment without speaking. And his 3 children, including the youngest who had grown 4 inches since the county gathering and who recognized her immediately. You're the buckle lady, he said. I am, she said. He looked at her with the absolute directness of a child who hadn't yet learned to soften assessments. Papa says you're the reason we're getting the land back. Your papa helped, she said, and a lot of other people. But you started it. She looked at the boy and then at his father and thought about the particular way that credit for complicated things got assigned. The way it always seemed to land most heavily on the most visible moment, on the person who appeared to have made the decisive move, while the years of preparation and the small accumulations and the slow building of capability that made the decisive moment possible remained invisible. The coffee tin remained invisible. I did something when there was something I could do, she said. That's all. Wick looked at her with the expression of a man who understood she was being more precise than modest, and who respected the distinction. Well, he said, it was enough. She met the other families over the following week, not all of them and not all at once, but in the natural way that people gathered when a process was happening that concerned them. a woman named Lena Proust whose husband had died 6 months after losing their ranch, who had spent those months believing the loss was her husband's failure rather than a crime committed against him. An older man named August Ferris who had been trying to get someone to listen to him about the deed discrepancy for 2 years and who looked at Mabel with the particular mix of gratitude and residual fury of someone whose story had finally been believed. A family of 4, the Robles family, who had traveled from a neighboring county when they heard the filing was moving and who had documents of their own that connected to the TMH operation through a parallel set of transactions that Webb added to the federal case within a day of reviewing them. Each of them had a version of the same story, shaped by their own specific circumstances, and each version was different in its details and the same in its structure. A powerful entity had identified something they owned and had decided to take it, and had used official channels and manufactured legitimacy, and the assumption that no one would look closely enough to stop them. She wasn't the only person who had looked closely. She had just been the one inside the operation, which gave her a particular angle of sight that the others hadn't had. She thought about Silas telling people she couldn't count past 10 without her fingers. She thought about that a lot in those weeks, not with anger exactly, or not only with anger, with something more complicated. Because the fact that Silas had underestimated her was the specific crack in the wall that everything else had come through, and she could be grateful for the crack while being very clear about who had made the wall. Rowan stayed in Casper. She hadn't been certain he would, had not assumed it, had not let herself build any architecture of expectation around what he would do because she was working hard to rebuild the distinction between what she hoped and what she expected, and the work was ongoing. But he stayed. He was working with Porter on a secondary documentation task related to the federal case, which gave him a practical reason, and she chose to take the practical reason at face value because it was available and because the alternative, examining what else might be keeping him, required a kind of self-belief she was still in the early stages of reconstructing. They had meals together, sometimes. Breakfast at a small place on Main Street, occasional evenings when the work ran late and they found themselves at the same table in the boarding house dining room. He talked about his 8 months in the territory, the people he'd met, the particular loneliness of doing work that required you to stay at the surface of relationships because you never knew how deep the fraud went or who was connected to it. She talked about the homestead sometimes, carefully, in the way you talk about something when you're still deciding how much of it you own versus how much of it owned you. One evening, 2 weeks after the federal filing, he said, "Porter offered me a different kind of work." She looked at him. "Not the traveling kind," he said, "something more fixed. He's building a formal practice around land fraud cases. There's enough of it in the territory that it warrants someone doing the investigative groundwork on a consistent basis. He wants someone who knows the land." "You know the land." "I do." He looked at his coffee. He also said he'd want a financial analyst once things are settled, someone who can read records and build the kind of documentation that holds up. He said he'd never had a witness who could do what you did with those ledgers. He looked up. "He means you." She looked at him steadily. "Porter offered me work. He was going to ask you directly. I'm not asking for him." A pause. "I just wanted you to know it was coming." She thought about the boarding house room above the office, which she'd been occupying for 2 weeks and which had begun to feel like a place rather than a temporary arrangement. She thought about the work with Ellis, about the days at the drafting table. She thought about the Robles family arriving with their documents and what it had meant to be the person who could look at those documents and say, "Yes, this connects, here's how, here's what it means." She thought about a lot of things. "I'll hear what he says," she said. "That's all I was suggesting." "I know it is." They sat for a moment in the comfortable way they had developed. Comfortable being a word she was still a little careful with because comfort had not always been safe, but which was the right word for this. "There's something I want to say," he said. She waited. "I'm not going to tell you who you should be from here, what you should weigh, how you should look, who you should become now that you're outside of it." He said it carefully, the way he said most things he'd thought through in advance. "I've got no business saying any of that. You are managing things I couldn't have managed and thinking things I wasn't thinking before I even got off the horse." He paused. "I just want to be around for whatever that's worth." She looked at him for a long moment, thought about the various ways she'd been told who she was across the years, by her father, by Silas, by the accumulated ambient voice of people who had looked at her and made their assessments and moved on. Thought about how much of her understanding of herself had been built from those assessments, how many load-bearing walls she'd constructed from other people's definitions. "It's worth something," she said. "I'm still figuring out how much." He nodded, like that was the right answer, or at least an honest one. 3 weeks after the federal filing, Silas Boone appeared before a federal magistrate in Cheyenne. Porter told her the outcome by letter. She'd stayed in Casper, where there was still work to do, and the Cheyenne proceedings were Webb's territory in any case. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and she read it at the drafting table with Ellis working quietly beside her. Silas had given full testimony. He had named the 2 senior TMH figures who had coordinated the Wyoming operation. A man named Hargrove and a man named Fitch, both based in Cheyenne, both arrested within 24 hours of Silas's testimony. The federal case against TMH was now the primary proceeding. Silas's county-level fraud charges were reduced to a single count with a sentencing agreement that included mandatory restitution to the 6 affected families and a permanent ban from land transactions in Wyoming territory. He would not go to prison. Not for long, and perhaps not at all, depending on the sentencing judge. She sat with that for a while. It wasn't what she would have chosen. She was honest enough with herself about that. About the part of her that wanted the full accounting, the complete consequence, the version of justice where the person who had done the harm felt the exact weight of it in return. That part of her was real, and she didn't try to silence it or moralize it away. But the land was going back. 4 families confirmed, 2 in process. Calloway was suspended and under investigation. Hargrove and Fitch were in federal custody. The operation that had been running for 7 years was finished. Silas had lost the thing he valued most, which was not freedom or even comfort, but the specific power of being unaccountable. He would spend the rest of his life having given testimony against the people above him, which in the community he'd operated in meant spending the rest of his life as someone who couldn't be trusted. He had traded one kind of survival for another, and the trade had cost him exactly the thing that had made him Silas Boone. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went back to the work in front of her. In the 6th week, Porter asked her formally. He sat across from her at his desk the way he'd sat across from her the first night, with papers between them and the direct manner of a man who said what he meant, and he offered her a position. Not a temporary one, not a courtesy arrangement, but an actual position with a salary and defined responsibilities, and the title of financial investigator, which was not a title that formally existed in the territory yet, but which Porter intended to make exist. "You'd be working with me on land fraud cases," he said. "Reading records, identifying fraudulent patterns, building the financial documentation that supports the legal filings. You'd be the person I call when the numbers don't add up." She looked at him. "I have no formal credentials." "No," he said. "You have something harder to acquire." "The pay," she said. He told her the number. It was more than she'd expected and less than Ellis made, which she noted without saying, because she understood the territory she was in and chose her first battles in it deliberately. "I'll want to revisit that number in 6 months," she said. He looked at her. "I imagine you will." He extended his hand across the desk. "We have a deal?" She shook it. The paper she signed that afternoon was the first document she'd ever put her name to that was entirely about what she could do rather than who she belonged to. She looked at her own signature for a moment after she set the pen down. Mabel Ashcroft. She'd gone back to her maiden name 3 days after the federal filing, through a process Porter had helped her initiate. She'd done it quietly, without ceremony, because it didn't require ceremony. It just required the paperwork and the decision. Mabel Ashcroft, her name in her own handwriting on a document that was hers. She thought about the coffee tin, about the worn edge of it and the careful sound of the lid going back on, and the way she'd counted the coins in the dark. $4.63, the sum total of a future she'd been building in secret for 14 months, which in the end she hadn't used to run and which she didn't have anymore. She didn't need it anymore. That was the thing she kept coming back to, in the quiet moments of those weeks. Not the dramatic arc of it, not the strongbox or the dry wash or the door she'd opened to Dunmore. Those were the visible parts, the parts that made the story, the parts that other people would remember. What she kept coming back to was the tin itself, the decision to start it. The anonymous Tuesday when she'd looked at that first quarter and made the choice to keep it, rather than return it or spend it or hand it over. The choice made in the dark with no audience and no certainty it would ever amount to anything. That had been the beginning. Everything after had grown from that. The greatest changes in a person's life, she was coming to understand, did not announce themselves. They arrived in the body of small decisions made when no one was watching. The choice to notice, the choice to record, the choice to hold on to something even when holding it felt pointless. They arrived in the daily, unremarkable choice to believe that the thing you were building had value, even when every surrounding voice disagreed. She had believed it in the dark for 14 months. She had carried it against her ribs through a field and a canyon and a 12-mile road. She had sat across from a judge's sealed injunction and a federal agent and a room full of people who needed what she knew, and she had known it. Not because she was exceptional, because she had paid attention when the world told her not to bother. That was what she wanted to tell the families, eventually. Not the Wicks and the Prousts and the Ferrises specifically, but the larger population of people who had been told by someone with more power that their understanding of their own situation was wrong, that they were slow or insufficient or too much in the wrong directions and not enough in the right ones. She wanted to tell them that the person who tells you that you can't count past 10 is counting on your belief in them, that your best defense against that particular kind of harm is boring and daily and undramatic. You just keep counting. She didn't say it in those words to anyone in particular. She said parts of it, at different times, in different forms, to Lena Proust over a cup of coffee, to Ellis when he was doubting himself on a difficult filing, to a woman she met in Mrs. Halverson's dining room who was asking careful questions about what Mabel did for work and listening to the answers with the specific attention of someone who was filing information for later. She said it in pieces, in the ordinary currency of conversation, and she let other people do with it what they could. Rowan was there for most of it. Not in the center of it. He had his own work, his own days, his own particular way of moving through the world that she was learning rather than assuming. But present. Reliably, quietly, without drama or declaration, in the way that people who have been through hard ground together sometimes simply stay near each other because the proximity is honest. One evening in October, the nights had gone cold in the full Wyoming way, the air carrying the specific dry chill she'd felt in the Harmon yard. She was standing outside Porter's office after a late session, looking at the street, and Rowan came out behind her and stood beside her. "Cold," he said. "Yes," she said. They stood there for a moment, looking at the street. At the ordinary Tuesday evening life of a working town, the lamp-lit windows and the last of the day's wagons and the particular stillness of a place settling into night. She thought about the Wyoming sky from the Boone homestead, how wide it had been, how indifferent, how she had looked up at it from the dirt of the yard and thought about being 20 years old. The sky was the same sky. She was standing under it differently. "You all right?" Rowan said. She thought about it, actually thought about it because she had enough distance now to answer honestly rather than reflexively. "Getting there," she said. "Not all the way yet." "That's all right," he said. "I know it is." They went back inside, where the work was, where it would be tomorrow and the day after that, where Mabel Ashcroft had a desk and a title and a salary that she intended to renegotiate in exactly 4 months and 3 weeks. She sat down and picked up the next file.